The storm arrived without mercy on the afternoon of September 24th, 1878, splitting the Montana sky like an axe through kindling. One moment, the horizon brooded gray and sullen. The next, the heavens tore open and hurled down rain so fierce it stung exposed flesh and transformed the wagon road through Crystal Creek into a roiling torrent of liquid earth. The cottonwoods lining the creek bent double under the assault, their silver-backed leaves flashing like distress signals, while the water rose with predatory speed, clawing at root systems that had anchored themselves through 50 winters and dragging them screaming into the current. Tokala stood on what remained of the eastern bank, water cascading off his long black braids and soaking through the heavy wool coat that covered his buckskin shirt. 28 years had carved his face into sharp planes and hard angles, the kind of countenance that revealed nothing and promised less. He never smiled, not from inability, but from understanding that smiling had never kept anyone breathing. That lesson had been burned into him twice, once at 12, watching blue-coated soldiers put his village to the torch, and again at 19 when he donned that same uniform to survive serving as an Army scout because the alternative was slow starvation on reservation land too barren to feed a prairie dog. The tattered scout pass folded inside his coat was a paper talisman that afforded him the thinnest protection within town boundaries, while earning him hatred from the loudest voices on both sides of every argument worth having. He had not ridden 2 hard days south from his people's encampment for pleasure. He carried one message for Gustav Voss, the man who owned the mine, squatting like a tumor on the hill above town. Your runoff poisons the river downstream. Children vomit after drinking. Elders cough blood. Fish float dead with milky eyes. Stop it, or we will find means to stop it for you. Tokala harbored no illusions about Voss listening to a Lakota man armed with paper and empty threats. Men like Voss only heeded guns pressed to their temples, and even then they negotiated. But silence meant surrender, and his people had surrendered enough. Now he dragged a drowning man from the swollen creek boots, slipping in muck muscles, screaming against the current's vicious pull. The man was Chinese, perhaps 40, with skin like old saddle leather and hands reduced to calluses and scars from years pulverizing ore in the stamp mill. Chen was his name, though most in Crystal Creek never bothered learning it. He worked 16-hour shifts for wages that barely purchased rice, and salt pork kept his head low and his mouth sealed because survival demanded it. But today his fingers locked around something wrapped in stained oilcloth, with the desperation of a man who knows too much and has run out of hiding places. Tokala seized the man's collar and hauled him clear boots, sinking ankle-deep shoulders burning with exertion. Chen expelled gray water in violent spasms, gasping and choking, yet refusing to release his burden. His knuckles showed white where they gripped the oilcloth package. Deputy riders crested the western ridge, 4 dark silhouettes against the bruised sky, rifles canted downward across their saddles, hat brims pulled low against the deluge. Their leader sat his mount with the confidence of someone who owned not merely the animal, but the weather itself and everything beneath. Jonas Caldwell was his name, though everyone called him Flint Face. His expression never shifted, not during beatings delivered in broad daylight, not at hangings, not when accepting money under tables and calling it civic duty. 50 years had weathered him into something resembling granite, complete with a waxed gray mustache and eyes like river stones polished cold. "Mum, step away from him." Flintface called his voice, carrying over the storm's roar, without rising above conversational pitch. "You are interfering with county business." Tokala remained motionless, crouched beside Chen in the mud, checking pulse and respiration, while ignoring the 4 rifles aimed at his spine. Fear only worked if you granted it power, and Tokala had stopped granting it power a lifetime ago. A woman materialized beside Tokala without warning, not cowering behind him, not pleading, simply stepping into view as though she had occupied that space all along. And the deputies had merely failed to notice. Louisa Greaves stood 26 years tall, 5 feet 7 inches in her stockings, with dark brown hair pinned severely back, and tea-colored eyes that missed little. Born in Manchester, England, orphaned at 9 when cholera took her parents aboard a steamship, she kept books in Voss's mine office and taught letters to children 3 evenings weekly in Dr. Harrow's clinic because the town paid her half a man's wage and called it generous. Her plain gray wool dress clung to her frame, soaked through, while her thin shawl hung like wet parchment. Louisa tilted her face skyward, water streaming into her eyes, and laughed. Not with joy or amusement. The sound emerged strangled and raw, involuntary, the kind of noise people made when screaming would betray them. It was gallows humor, the desperate reflex of someone whose better options had evaporated. Tokala's eyes cut toward her, sharp as a skinning knife. The laugh struck against his silence like flint on steel. He could not parse what sort of person laughed facing danger, but he catalogued it under things worth remembering, things that revealed character beneath careful manners. Chen convulsed again harder and thrust the oilcloth bundle toward Louisa with trembling hands, barely capable of holding on. His lips shaped 2 words, in halting English nearly inaudible beneath the downpour. Assay book. A rifle cracked. Dirt geysered near Tokala's boot, close enough to spray cold mud across his knee and make Louisa flinch sideways. She laughed again, smaller, tighter, a sound caught between her teeth, because fear was attempting to commandeer her lungs, and she required some outlet for the pressure building in her chest, like steam in a boiler. She clamped her jaw shut, swallowed hard enough to hurt, and accepted the bundle from Chen's quaking fingers. Her hands held steady despite everything else trembling. Flintface urged his horse forward several paces, close enough now that Tokala could observe water dripping in steady streams from the sheriff's waxed mustache. "Miss Louisa," he said, his tone approximating politeness, as though they discussed the weather at a church social rather than standing in a storm with weapons drawn. "You should step back now. This man is a fugitive from justice. We have lawful business with him." He was drowning, Louisa stated flatly, her voice carrying the precise quality she employed reading numbers aloud in the mine office. "Extracting a drowning man from water violates no statute, I know. Obstructing lawful arrest does." Flintface replied, his voice never rising, never fluctuating in tone or temperature. He looked at Tokala with those cold stone eyes. "Show me your pass, Scout." Tokala reached deliberately into his coat, moving with calculated slowness so no one would misinterpret the gesture as reaching for a weapon, and withdrew the paper. Sweat rain and too many foldings had stained and creased it nearly to illegibility, but the captain's signature and territorial military office stamp remained visible. The pass was barely a scrap of protection in a world that wanted him gone, yet sufficient to make Flintface pause. Killing a man carrying official papers created the sort of mess that attracted questions from distant offices indifferent to local power structures. Flintface studied the pass extensively, then returned it without comment. "You possess the right to move freely," he said slowly, as though tasting each word before releasing it. "For the present. However, obstructing county business constitutes another matter entirely, and the law frowns upon such interference." He shifted his gaze to Louisa, and something frigid moved behind his eyes. "Surrender the bundle, Miss Greaves. That is county property. It is private property." Louisa countered her voice, maintaining its careful precision, though her heart hammered so violently she feared he might hear it. "If you wish to confiscate it, Sheriff Caldwell, you may obtain a warrant from Judge Carver. I believe that represents proper legal procedure." Flintface smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. It belonged to a man who knew he held all the cards and was deciding how slowly to play them, how much pain to inflict before claiming his prize. "I will remember you said that, Miss Greaves," he said softly. "I will remember it with perfect clarity." He wheeled his horse and rode back toward the ridge, his 3 deputies following in formation. The torrent swallowed them within seconds, but Tokala knew they had not departed. Men like Flintface never left until they obtained what they wanted, and if the front door proved locked, they simply kicked in the back. Chen coughed once more, weaker now, barely more than a rattle in his chest, and his hand fell away from the oilcloth. Tokala caught him before he collapsed into the mud, lifting him with both arms, and the weight made his shoulders burn and his legs shake. The man was not heavy malnutrition, and brutal labor had stripped most weight from his frame, but dead weight always proved harder than living weight, and Chen was barely clinging to consciousness. Louisa walked beside them through the muck, clutching the bundle against her chest as they made their way through the sheeting downpour toward the low building on the eastern edge of town, where Dr. Jules Harrow maintained his clinic. Crystal Creek was a mining town, erected on twin pillars, gold and control. The mine perched on the hill like a malevolent eye, its stamp mill pounding ceaselessly with a rhythm that shook the ground and burrowed into your bones until you felt it even attempting sleep. Gustav Voss owned the mine, and through it commanded most of the town in ways no legal document recorded, but everyone understood. He owned the company store where prices inflated and credit flowed easily, but could never be repaid. He owned the bunkhouses where miners slept 3 to a narrow bed with straw mattresses breeding lice and bedbugs. He owned the saloon where those same miners drank away their wages every Saturday night. And he owned Thomas Earl, the land office deputy, who ensured boundary lines on official maps remained precisely where Voss desired them, regardless of what survey markers actually indicated. Sheriff Caldwell maintained order the way a butcher preserved meat, by hanging it where everyone could see it and letting the stench serve as warning. 2 hangings had occurred in the past month alone, both for theft of company property, both executed in the town square before the territorial judge could arrive to review cases or hear testimony from the accused. The bodies lay in shallow graves on the eastern edge of town, and no one asked questions because asking questions proved an excellent method of occupying the next shallow grave. Dursterhart, Jules Harrow's clinic was a single-story structure of rough-cut planks, with clay chinking that had cracked and fallen away, in places admitting wind through the gaps. The steeply peaked roof leaked in at least 3 locations that Jules had marked with buckets. The main room contained a scarred wooden work table shelves lined with brown glass medicine bottles and surgical instruments that had seen better decades, and a small cast-iron stove that struggled to heat the space even on mild days. A smaller room in back, separated by a canvas curtain, served as the doctor's sleeping quarters, though he rarely occupied it more than a few hours nightly. Jules was a Frenchman in his early 40s, with graying hair falling across his forehead in unruly waves, and a visible tremor in both hands he could not conceal, and had ceased attempting to hide. He had emigrated 10 years prior, with a medical degree from the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, and a habit of asking questions that made powerful men profoundly uncomfortable. For 6 months past, he had treated miners exhibiting symptoms matching no disease from his training hands, that shook uncontrollably and could not steady a spoon teeth that rotted at the root and fell out in bloody fragments, sudden rages that struck like lightning and left men weeping and confused, and a slow, creeping madness that transformed rational men into hollow-eyed specters who mumbled to themselves in darkness. Jules suspected mercury poisoning from the mine's gold amalgamation process, where liquid quicksilver was mixed with crushed ore to bind gold particles for separation and refining. He had been quietly collecting river sediment samples in sealed glass jars, labeling them with dates and locations, writing detailed notes in a journal he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under his bed notes he could not publish or share without inviting his own murder. When Tokala and Louisa brought Chen through the door, hinges screaming protest, Jules wasted no time on questions or explanations. He swept one arm across his work table, sending papers and instruments clattering to the floor, and gestured sharply for them to lay the man down. Chen's skin had gone gray. As old ash, his lips tinged blue, and water seeped from his mouth in continuous thin trickles that pooled on the table and dripped to the floor. How long was he in the river? Jules asked, his French accent coloring the English but not impeding clarity. He was already pressing 2 fingers to the pulse point in Chen's neck, counting silently. Not long. Tokala said, his voice flat, but he swallowed considerable water. His lungs are compromised. Jules nodded, one expression grim, and pressed his ear to Chen's chest. The sound he heard tightened his jaw, a wet, rattling gurgle indicating the lungs were drowning from within. "I will do what I can," he said quietly, already moving to grab clean cloths from a shelf. "But he requires rest and warmth, and he requires them immediately." Louisa set the oilcloth bundle on a high shelf where it would remain dry, then moved directly to the small iron stove in the corner. She knelt before it, disregarding her already soaked dress, and began feeding kindling into the firebox with quick, practiced movements. Her hands moved without hesitation, breaking kindling to proper lengths, arranging it to permit airflow, blowing on coals until small flames licked at the wood and began growing. She did not request permission or await instruction. She simply executed what required doing, as she always had. Outside, the storm showed no inclination to abate. Crystal Creek's streets stood empty, save for a few men hurrying between buildings with coats pulled tight and heads down. The mine sat dark and silent on the hill. For once the stamp mill shut down, because even Voss would not risk sending men up there in weather like this. The only sound was the relentless percussion of rain on tin roofs and the occasional thunder crack rolling across the valley. Jules worked over Chen with focused intensity, born from losing too many patients and knowing he could not afford another loss. He turned the man onto his side and pressed carefully on his back, forcing water up and out of his lungs in thick gray gouts. He tilted Chen's head at an angle to maintain airway clearance and prevent choking. He wrapped him in every blanket Louisa could locate in the back room, old wool blankets reeking of camphor and sweat, but dry and warm. Despite everything Jules did, Chen's breathing grew shallower with each passing minute, the pauses between breaths lengthening ominously. Chen's eyes opened once sudden and desperate pupils blown wide with terror. He reached out blindly with one trembling hand, and Louisa knelt beside the table without thought, taking his icy fingers in hers. He squeezed with what little strength remained and pressed something small and hard into her palm. A brass tag, rectangular and worn smooth, the kind used to mark and track equipment in the mine's assay room. It bore Voss's stamp, a stylized V enclosed in a circle alongside a number 14. "Key," Chen whispered, his voice barely more than breath, each word costing him dearly. "Proof. In room. Do not let them bury it." Then his chest ceased moving. Simply ceased, as sudden and final as a door slamming. Jules tried desperately to revive him. He did not pound at the chest like a modern rescuer. He worked the way a frontier doctor could. He hooked 2 fingers in Chen's mouth to clear mud, and water rolled him onto his side to let the river drain, and then dragged his arms up and back in the old Sylvester fashion, trying to make the ribs lift and fall. He rubbed Chen's limbs hard to bring heat back, barked for blankets, and poured a thin stream of whiskey across Chen's lips, only to wet them, not to drown him further. He held a vial of sharp-smelling salts beneath Chen's nose, waiting for the smallest flinch. Nothing came. Jules kept counting under his breath in French, as if numbers could shame death into retreat. When he finally stopped, he sat back as though the air itself had turned to iron, his hands trembling and useless at his sides. "He is gone," the doctor said quietly, and deep bone-tired sorrow inhabited those simple words, speaking of too many losses, too many men he could not save. Louisa reached out with steady fingers and closed Chen's eyes with a gentle touch, her face expressionless, but her throat tight. She did not weep. She simply stood, looked down at the small brass tag in her palm, and made a decision that would alter everything following. "I need to access the mine office," she said, her voice calm and clear. Takala looked at her expression, unreadable. "That represents considerable risk. Flintface will anticipate it. Greater risk lies in leaving proof hidden," Louisa replied, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Chen died carrying this. If we do nothing, he died for nothing, and they will bury whatever he was attempting to reveal." Jules wiped his hands slowly on a stained cloth expression, grim as death itself. "If you go, Miss Louisa, you will require a reason they will accept. They will be watching for you now." "I work there," Louisa said simply. "I can claim I am fetching medical supplies for you, bandages, carbolic acid, whatever sounds plausible." Takala studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against necessity, his dark eyes measuring her resolve. Then he gave a single decisive nod. "I will accompany you." "They will observe you," she warned. "They will know something is wrong." "Acceptable," Takala said flatly. "Let them observe me. They will hesitate before acting because of this." He touched the scout pass pinned to his coat. "And that hesitation might constitute all we require." The mine office was a 2-story structure situated near town center, built of milled lumber that had been shipped in at great expense, and painted pristine white to showcase Voss's prosperity and power. The first floor housed a row of clerks' desks, where daily mine business was conducted, a massive iron payroll safe bolted to the floor, and the company store where miners purchased supplies at prices carefully calculated to maintain perpetual debt. The second floor housed Voss's private office, richly appointed with furniture incongruous in a mining town, and the assay room where ore samples were tested for gold content, and the real numbers, the ones that mattered, were carefully recorded in ledgers that never left the building. The assay room was what Chen's brass tag would open if it functioned as Louisa hoped. Louisa entered through the front door, shaking rain from her shawl with quick, practiced movements, drawing no particular attention. The clerk at the main desk, a young man named Samuel, who could not have been more than 20 with soft hands and nervous eyes, looked up in surprise upon seeing her. "Miss Louisa," he said, his voice uncertain and slightly higher than normal. "I did not expect to see you in this weather. Is everything satisfactory?" "Dr. Harrow is treating an injured man and has exhausted his supply of bandages and carbolic acid," Louisa said smoothly, her tone matter-of-fact and slightly annoyed, as though the errand were an inconvenience thrust upon her through no fault of her own. "I thought we still maintained some stock in the second-floor storage room. I came to verify before wasting time at the general store." Samuel nodded quickly, already looking back down at the ledger, occupying his attention, clearly eager to avoid involvement in anything requiring him to make decisions. "Of course, Miss Louisa. Help yourself. You know where everything is located." Louisa climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the second floor, her wet boots leaving dark prints on the worn treads. Takala followed several steps behind his presence, drawing immediate, uncomfortable stares from the handful of men browsing company store shelves below. His scout pass was clearly visible on his coat, pinned there like a badge, and that made him just barely legal enough to be tolerated, but nowhere near welcome enough to be ignored. Conversation ceased as he passed. Eyes tracked him with the wary hostility typically reserved for wolves wandering too close to sheep pens. The assay room waited at the hallway's far end, behind a heavy door painted dark green and fitted with a brass lock mechanism. Louisa withdrew Chen's tag from her pocket and inserted it carefully into the narrow slot below the doorknob. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened, and she thought perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps the tag was not a key after all. Then something inside the lock clicked with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hallway, and the door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was small and windowless, lit only by gray light filtering in from the hallway, and the faint glow of a single oil lamp hanging from a ceiling hook. Shelves lined all four walls, crowded with glass jars containing ore samples of varying colors and textures, delicate balance scales for weighing gold, and rows of brown glass bottles filled with chemicals. Mercury, nitric acid, sulfuric acid, cyanide salts, all carefully labeled in precise handwriting. A large wooden desk sat squarely in the room's center, its surface cluttered with papers, pencils worn down to nubs, and an assortment of measuring tools. Louisa moved to the desk and began searching with quick, methodical efficiency, her hands moving through stacks of paper and opening drawers, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she sought. She located the main assay book first, a heavy leather-bound ledger recording every ore sample tested over the past year. The entries appeared normal at first glance: dates, sample numbers, gold content measured in ounces per ton, total tonnage processed. Everything neat and orderly, and precisely what one would expect to find. But Louisa knew from her work that numbers could lie beautifully if you understood how to arrange them. And her fingers were already searching beneath the false bottom of the center desk drawer, a hiding place she had discovered months earlier while filing paperwork and had filed away in memory as potentially useful. Her fingers found the edge of a second ledger, smaller and bound in plain black cloth. She extracted it carefully and opened it to the first page. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat and her heart start hammering against her ribs. Quicksilver, 400 lbs, September 3rd, 1878, $120 paid Sheriff J. Caldwell. Monthly retainer, $200 for silence and access. Ongoing judge's clerk R. Morris, $50. August payment. Delayed warrants as needed. Land Office Deputy T. Earl, $100. July payment. Boundary adjustments and well rights documentation. And at the bottom of one page, written in what she recognized as Gustav Voss's own slanted handwriting, a notation that made her stomach turn cold and sick. River dumping, night runs only, no witnesses after cross incident, surveyor problem permanently handled Sept 9. Heavy footsteps halted directly outside the door. Deliberate footsteps, the kind that wanted to be heard. Flintface's voice slid through the open doorway, like a blade sliding between ribs, calm and cold and patient. Miss Louisa, I know you occupy that room. Step out now, if you please. Louisa's breath stuck hard in her throat. The lamp flame flickered as if responding to her fear. There was no window in this room, no second door, no exit, except through the hallway, where Flintface waited. Tokala stepped immediately between her and the doorway, his right hand moving smoothly to rest on the handle of the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. It was not a threat, not yet. It was simply a statement of fact. You will have to pass through me first. Flintface's voice came again, still patient, still cold, with that terrible calm, somehow worse than shouting. I know what you took from Chen, Miss Greaves, and I know what you are searching for in that room. Open the door wide and step out with your hands visible. Do it now, or I will break this door down and charge you both with theft of company property. Louisa looked at Tokala, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none ending well. His face was stone, revealing nothing, but his eyes were clear and alert, already calculating angles and distances. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod toward the desk, and Louisa understood instantly. She shoved the black ledger into her canvas satchel with quick, rough movements, then deliberately stumbled as if her wet skirts had caught on the desk leg, and the satchel fell from her hands, landing directly at Tokala's feet. Tokala's hand closed on the satchel strap and pulled it behind him in one smooth motion, all without looking down his eyes, never leaving the doorway. Flintface observed the motion. His expression did not change. It never changed, but his right hand moved to rest on the polished wooden grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. Seize him, he said flatly to someone Louisa could not see. Take him into custody for questioning regarding theft of company property and interference with a lawful investigation. 2 deputies appeared in the doorway. Both young men Louisa vaguely recognized from the saloon, both holding rifles at an awkward angle, suggesting they were not entirely comfortable with what they were being ordered to do, but were more afraid of disobeying Flint-Face than they were of their own consciences. The deputies moved forward into the small room, and that was when Tokala acted. He did not throw wild punches like a barroom brawler or attempt to fight 2 armed men with his bare hands like some dime novel hero. Instead, he employed the environment the way he had been taught to use terrain in combat. He grabbed the heavy wooden desk with both hands and shoved it hard toward the doorway, the corner catching the first deputy's outstretched hand with a sickening crack that broke at least 2 fingers. The man screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his hand. Tokala grabbed Louisa's arm, his grip hard enough to bruise through the wet fabric, and pulled her toward the only other option available: a narrow supply closet door in the back corner of the room. The closet was cramped and dark, filled with stacked crates and smelling of dust and old paper. But Louisa remembered something from her first week working in the building, a ventilation hatch in the ceiling installed to prevent dangerous chemical fumes from accumulating. Tokala saw at the same moment she pointed upward. He dragged over a wooden crate, boosted Louisa up without ceremony, and she shoved the hatch cover aside and pulled herself through into a cramped attic space that smelled of old wood and rat droppings. Tokala followed immediately behind her, pulling the crate up after him with one hand and wedging it against the hatch to slow anyone who tried to follow. They crawled through darkness, on hands and knees, splinters digging into their palms, dust choking their throats, until they located another hatch opening onto the roof. Rain struck them like a fist the moment they emerged, cold and blinding. Tokala pulled Louisa to her feet, and they ran across the slick shingles boots, slipping with every step until they reached the edge. Below lay a narrow alley, perhaps 12 feet down, with mud deep enough to cushion a fall if fortune smiled and break legs if it did not. Tokala did not hesitate. He lowered himself over the edge, hung for a moment by his fingertips, and then dropped. He landed in a crouch, absorbing impact with bent knees, and immediately looked up. "Jump," he called. "I will catch you." Louisa heard shouting behind her boots on the roof. She did not think. She jumped. Tokala caught her, or attempted to. His hands grabbed her waist and broke her fall, but momentum still took them both down hard into the cold mud. For a moment, they lay there gasping. Wind knocked from them, rain pounding their faces. Then Tokala was hauling her upright with that same bruising grip, and they were running again, sprinting down the alley toward the eastern edge of town. A rifle shot cracked behind them, impossibly loud, even through the storm. Wood splintered from a building corner 3 inches from Louisa's head, close enough that she felt the shock of impact through the air. Her boot caught on a submerged board, and she went down hard on one knee, her dress tangling around her legs. Tokala's hand was already there, clamping around her forearm and yanking her upright with a force that made her shoulders scream protest. But she bit down on the pain and kept moving because stopping meant dying. They sprinted toward the river footbridge, a narrow suspension structure of rough planks and hemp rope that swayed and groaned even in calm weather. Now, with the creek transformed into a raging torrent, 15 feet below the bridge, pitched and rolled like something alive and angry. Bullets chewed into the planks behind them as they ran, punching neat holes through wet wood and sending splinters flying through rain. Tokala pulled a coil of rope from inside his coat. He always carried rope because, in his experience, rope saved lives more often than weapons or fortune. And his fingers moved with practiced speed, tying a quick bowline around Louisa's waist. It was not gentle or romantic. It was pure, desperate survival. "If you fall," he said, his voice flat and certain, even as the bridge swayed sickeningly beneath their feet. "I will pull you up. Do not release the rope." "Understood." Louisa's breath came in short, sharp gasps that tore at her throat, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. A laugh attempted to burst from her chest, short, ugly, and voluntary, and she bit down on it hard enough to taste blood. Understood. She managed to gasp, her voice shaking badly. They crossed the bridge at a stumbling run, the structure swaying wildly beneath them with every step, the ropes creaking under strain and wind. Another rifle shot rang out, and the rope support on Louisa's left side frayed and snapped with a sound like a whip crack. The bridge tilted hard to one side, the angle shifting from steep to nearly vertical. Louisa's boots lost purchase on wet planks, and she started to slide toward churning water below. Her fingers scrabbled desperately at the remaining rope, finding purchase, and Tokala lunged forward and grabbed the back of her dress with both hands, hauling her bodily toward the far side of the bridge, with strength born entirely of desperation, rather than any superhuman ability. His arms shook with effort, and his boots slipped twice, nearly sending them both over the edge. But somehow they made it to solid ground on the eastern bank. They did not cease running. They plunged immediately into the cottonwood grove, lining the creek, the trees providing some cover from rain and rifles both. Behind them, they could hear shouting, but Flintface was not following on foot. He was smarter than that. He was already turning his horse back toward a town center, toward the telegraph office, because he did not need to chase them himself. He possessed the entire apparatus of power at his disposal, and he intended using it to transform the whole town into a net that would eventually ensnare them. They fled east into rocky hills rising steeply behind Crystal Creek, where old mining roads cut through gullies and ravines like knife wounds in earth. The storm showed no inclination to ease. If anything, it intensified as they climbed higher, wind howling through rocks and driving rain nearly horizontal. Every slope had transformed into a treacherous slide of mud and loose stone. Tokala moved carefully, despite their need for speed testing each foothold before trusting his weight to it. And Louisa followed as best she could, her hands soon scraped raw from grabbing at rocks and roots to prevent sliding backward. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes, lungs burning and legs shaking with exhaustion, until they finally reached a shallow limestone overhang set back into a ravine wall. Not a cave exactly, but a place where rock jutted out far enough to provide shelter from the worst of the downpour. Tokala carefully wedged the satchel containing the ledger under the driest part of the overhang, and then crouched at the very edge of the shelter, his dark eyes scanning the valley below for any sign of pursuit. Louisa collapsed against cold stone wall chest, heaving as she tried to force air into burning lungs, dress soaked through and clinging to her skin like a second layer of ice. Her whole body shook from cold, from exhaustion, from adrenaline starting to wear off and leave her feeling hollow and sick. After a long moment of watchful silence, Tokala pulled the black ledger from the satchel and handed it to Louisa without a word. "Tell me what it says," he said quietly. "All of it." Louisa took the ledger with fingers that felt clumsy and numb. She opened it carefully, squinting in the dim gray light filtering into their shelter, and began reading aloud. "Quicksilver," she said, her voice still unsteady. 400 pounds purchased in the first week of September alone. That far exceeds what the mine should require. She turned the page. Monthly payments to Sheriff Jonas Caldwell, $200 every month. Payments to the judge's clerk to delay warrants. Payments to Thomas Earl, the deputy at the land office, for boundary adjustments and well rights documentation. She paused, her throat constricting. And a note about dumping waste into the river at night. And this surveyor problem permanently handled September 9th. Tokala's jaw tightened. "The river dies downstream," he said quietly, but cold fury beneath the quiet made the words land like stones. "Children drink that water and vomit until they are too weak to stand. And these men knew." A sound from below made them both freeze, the distinctive scrape of boots on loose rock. A figure emerged from the rain, moving with an awkward, lurching gait, one hand pressed tight against his ribs. It was Dr. Jules Harrow, his face a mass of fresh bruises, already turning purple and black, his left eye swollen nearly shut. "They came for me," Jules said hoarsely. "Not 10 minutes after you departed. They wanted to know what Chen had told me before he expired." He touched his ribs gingerly and winced. "I told them nothing, but they did not believe me. They beat me until I could not stand." Louisa moved quickly to help him sit under the overhang, her hands gentle as she examined the damage. His ribs were clearly broken on the left side. "You should not have pursued us," she said quietly. "I need justice more than I need rest," Jules said firmly, though his voice was weak. He pulled a small glass jar from his coat pocket. Inside was a thick layer of gray-brown sediment. "I collected this from the river 3 days ago. I have tested it. It contains mercury. Sufficient to kill fish, sufficient to poison anyone who drinks from that water regularly." He looked at Tokala. "I can prove the poisoning is real, but proof means nothing if it never departs this town." Tokala looked at the jar, then at the black ledger. "We must send word to the territorial marshal," he said. "Someone with authority that Flint-Face cannot purchase." "The telegraph office," Louisa said immediately. "But Flint-Face controls it. The operator is Dan Whitfield, and he owes gambling debts throughout town." Jules nodded slowly. "Dan is not a malicious man, but he is a terrified one. However, if we can present him an offer worth more than his debts." "We offer him immunity," Tokala said flatly. "A sworn statement that he acted under duress, that protection possesses more value than money." That night, under cover of steady drizzle, they crawled through cold mud toward the telegraph line, running along Crystal Creek's eastern edge. The ground was saturated, every depression filled with standing water. Tokala moved ahead like a scout, checking the route with patient care, while Louisa and Jules followed more slowly, with Jules leaning heavily on Louisa's shoulder. The telegraph office was a small wooden shack set near the rail depot. A single oil lamp burned in the narrow window. Through rain-streaked glass, they could see a thin figure hunched over the brass telegraph key. Dan Whitfield was in his early 30s, painfully thin with dark circles shadowing his eyes. Tokala approached the door and knocked 3 times sharp, deliberate raps. Inside, Dan jumped so violently he nearly knocked over his chair. He cracked the door open just wide enough to peer out. When he saw Tokala's face, his eyes went wide, and he tried to slam the door shut. Tokala jammed his boot into the gap. "We need your help, Mr. Whitfield," Tokala said quietly. "Please, listen before you decide." "I do not help fugitives," Dan said, his voice shaking. "Flint-Face will kill me." "We are not fugitives," Louisa said, stepping into the light. "We are witnesses to federal crimes, murder, corruption, poisoning. We possess proof." Dan's eyes went to the bruises on Jules's face, then to the satchel Louisa carried. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that will hang men who believe themselves above the law," Jules said quietly. Dan stared at them for a long moment. Then slowly he stepped back and opened the door wider. "You have 5 minutes. But if Flint-Face comes, I will swear I never saw you." Jules dictated the message in short, clear sentences. Mercury poisoning confirmed. Federal surveyor Martin Cross death covered as accident. Evidence of corruption and fraud. Documentary proof available. Request immediate intervention. Location Crystal Creek. Urgent. Dan's fingers hovered over the key, not moving, his face pale. "If I send this, Flint-Face will know. He will hang me before the marshal can arrive." Then you die for something real, Jules said softly. You die fighting men who deserve to be fought. I cannot promise you will be safe. But I can promise that what you do tonight matters. Dan stared at him, and then at Louisa, then at Tokala. Something shifted behind his eyes. His hands moved to the key, and he began to tap. The clicks were sharp and rhythmic, filling the small room. He was perhaps halfway through when the door exploded inward with a splintering crash. Sheriff Jonas Caldwell stood framed in the doorway, rain streaming from his hat, his pistol already drawn. Behind him were two deputies with rifles. "Step away from that key," Flintface said. Dan's hands did not stop. They moved faster, his fingers blurring across the brass key, sweat pouring down his face. Flintface crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Dan's hair, and slammed his face into the desk. Blood exploded across the surface. The brass key was slick with it, but Dan's hand kept moving, kept tapping, finishing the last sequence, even as Flintface hauled him backward and threw him against the wall. Dan slid down and collapsed, blood streaming from his face. But his eyes were open and clear and almost peaceful. "Take him to the jail," Flintface said to his deputies. "Lock him up." The deputies dragged Dan out into the rain. Flintface turned to face Tokala, Louisa, and Jules, his pistol still in hand. "You people have caused me considerable trouble," he said calmly. "The warrant on the scout here says dead or alive, and I am strongly inclined toward dead." He raised the pistol, aiming at Tokala's chest. A rifle shot cracked from outside. One of the deputies screamed and went down, clutching his leg. Another figure appeared in the doorway, a long coat hanging open and a shotgun braced against one shoulder. The man was young, with an easy grin and eyes that tracked exits. His name was Bold Bob Rusk, a traveling bounty hunter. "Now, Sheriff," Bob said lightly, "I believe you are interfering with my lawful bounty. That man possesses a federal warrant which makes him federal business, and I arrived first." Flintface turned slowly. "This is county business, bounty hunter. Actually, a federal warrant supersedes county jurisdiction." Bob said, his grin widening. "Now I am a reasonable man. You are going to holster that pistol and let me handle my business." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Flintface lowered his pistol and holstered it. His face showed no emotion. "This is not finished," Flintface said quietly. He turned and walked out into the rain. Bob lowered his shotgun and looked at them. "You folks need to move, right now. When he returns, he will bring more men and less patience." They fled into the eastern hills with Bold Bob as their unexpected companion. Bob did not help from kindness. He helped because people who made powerful enemies on behalf of federal crimes usually had substantial rewards attached. They reached an abandoned line shack as dawn approached. The shack was a sagging wreck with a leaking roof, but it was shelter. Inside, Bob positioned himself near the door and leveled his shotgun at them. "Now we discuss terms." Louisa held up the black ledger. "Then you want Flintface and Voss, not us." Bob's eyes flicked to the ledger. "Flintface is paying $300 for the scout." He pulled out a folded wanted poster and threw it on the floor. It was a wanted notice with Tokala's name, "Wanted for murder." Tokala, Federal Surveyor Martin Cross, reward $500. Jules picked up the poster, his hands shaking. "Cross did not die on the prairie," he said quietly. "He died in the mine. I saw the body. His chest was crushed by falling rock. They made me sign it as an accident." Louisa's breath caught. "They killed a federal surveyor." "To hide the boundary lines," Jules said. "Cross was mapping the land around the mine. He found something Voss did not want found. Bob's expression shifted. If that is true, then this is not a legitimate warrant. It is fabrication to conceal federal murder, which means anyone who collects on it becomes an accessory. He looked at the poster like it had become a snake. A rifle shot punched through the wall, the bullet passing where Bob's head had been. Everyone hit the floor. Tokala's head snapped toward the sound. Sniper. High ground 200 yards west, northwest. Bob swore and crawled toward the door. He risked a glance, then jerked back as another shot tore through the wall. One shooter on that rocky outcrop. We are pinned. Louisa looked at Tokala. We cannot stay here. We cannot run in the open, Tokala replied. The sniper will pick us off. Another shot punched through the roof. We go down slope, Tokala said. Into the gulch. Bob looked at him like he was mad. That gulch leads to the tailings pond. If the dam fails, thunder cracked overhead. The rain intensified. We move now, Tokala said, or we die here. They ran. The gulch was narrow and steep with loose rock underfoot and walls that wept mud. The sniper fired twice more bullets, sparking off stone, but the angle was bad. They scrambled downward until the gulch opened near the tailings pond. The pond was a black mirror under the storm, held back by a rough earthen dam. The water lapped against the dam's face, higher than it should be, and cracks spidered through the earth. Jules grabbed Louisa's sleeve. If that dam fails, it failed. The sound was deep and terrible, a groaning from the earth itself. The dam's face slumped, then collapsed in a rush of black water and debris. A wave 6 feet high surged into the gulch, carrying boards, tools, and the bloated corpse of a mule. The flood was not just water. It was the mine's waste, thick with mercury and chemicals racing toward the river and toward Tokala's people. Tokala shoved Louisa toward a rock outcrop jutting from the gulch wall. She scrambled up, hands finding holds in wet stone boots, slipping but catching again. Below, Jules struggled to climb. His injured ribs made every movement agony. Louisa reached down and grabbed his coat collar, pulling with all her strength. Tokala pushed from below, and together they hauled the doctor onto the ledge. The flood roared past beneath them. Bob pulled himself up last, gasping. Once they could breathe, Louisa laughed again, tight, bitter, involuntary. Tokala stared at her. It keeps me from screaming, Louisa said. That is all. Tokala nodded once. He did not judge it. Below them, the flood continued. Above them, the sniper waited. They planned their escape, brutally get the truth out before Flintface buried them with the evidence. The telegraph office battle had worked. Dan had finished the message. But they needed to survive until the marshal arrived. They moved through the canyon, Flintface's deputies closing in. The sniper fired from above each shot, forcing them to stay low. Louisa found a mine supply box, half buried in mud. Inside were blasting supplies, fuses, caps, black powder. She grabbed what she needed, along with a surveyor's iron spike, and drove the spike into a crack to anchor a rope across a slick ledge. Tokala passed her his flint striker. Their fingers brushed. Not romance. A tool. A pact. Louisa set the charge at the sniper's ledge, cutting the fuse short. She lit it, and they scrambled back as the explosion tore through rock. The ledge collapsed, blocking the sniper's line and forcing him to retreat. The cave-in destabilized the hillside. Another section of the mine wall gave way, blocking the deputies, but also trapping Tokala and the others. Jules could not stand after taking a hit from falling rock. His leg was broken. Louisa refused to abandon him. Tokala made the only choice. He lifted Jules onto his shoulder, not superhuman, but desperate and straining. His knees buckled once, but he steadied and kept moving. Louisa climbed beside them, using the rope. Below, Flintface aimed at Louisa. "Drop the ledger, or I put her down." Louisa looked at Tokala. Do not come back unless you can win. Takala turned. For the first time in years, his mouth moved into a small, controlled smile, barely there, but real. Not romance. A promise. He kicked loose a rock onto Flintface's rifle barrel, just as the man fired, knocking the shot wide. Then the flash flood slammed through again. Flintface's horse reared. By the time he regained control, they were gone. 2 days later, the territorial marshal rode into Crystal Creek. Marshal Samuel Grant brought 6 deputies and authority that Flintface could not purchase. Louisa met him at Dr. Jules's clinic. She produced the black ledger. Jules presented his jars of sediment and a sworn statement about the dead surveyor. Bob stepped forward. "I got dragged into a federal killing," Bob told the marshal. "I am not hanging for Flintface." He handed over the wanted poster and named the men who paid for it. Flintface tried to spin it as Indian violence, but the evidence stripped the lie bare. The ledger showed payments. The sediment showed poison. The surveyor's death was documented. Grant arrested Voss, first dragging him from his office in front of the town. Then he moved to arrest Flintface. They found him at the eastern edge of town, mounted packed saddlebag behind him, ready to run. When they ordered him to halt, he did not comply. His hand went to his pistol. "I am not going to hang," he said, his voice cold and flat. "I would rather die here." "Do not do this, Caldwell," a deputy said. "There is no chance," Flintface interrupted. "The only choice is how I go." His finger tightened on the trigger. 3 deputies fired simultaneously. Flintface jerked as bullets struck chest, abdomen, shoulder. For just a moment, his face showed something other than cold nothing. Recognition that he had met something he could not control. He fell from his horse into the mud. Blood spread across his shirt. When Grant arrived, Flintface was still alive barely. His breathing was labored. "You will not make this stand in court," Flintface said, his voice still cold. "You have no idea how deep this extends. There are others. There are always others." "Then you will have time to explain at your trial," Grant replied. "I will not," Flintface said with certainty. "And you cannot make me talk." He died 3 minutes later in the mud, eyes open, staring at gray sky without seeing. Grant stood slowly. "Get him to the undertaker and find Gustav Voss." Voss was arrested at his mansion, dragged from his study where he had been burning papers. Thomas Earl tried to flee on the morning train, but was arrested on the platform. The judge's clerk, Morris, vanished. Some said Mexico, others said he died crossing the mountains. In the days that followed, change came to Crystal Creek slowly but profoundly. The trials were held that autumn. Voss received 20 years for bribery, corruption, and accessory to murder. He appealed with expensive lawyers, but the conviction stood. He died in prison in 1880, officially of pneumonia, though no one investigated too closely. Earl pleaded guilty for a reduced sentence. 15 years for fraud and corruption. He served 8 before dying of fever in 1886. Morris was never found. The mine was shut down for 2 months while a court-appointed receiver and a new foreman took control. Wages were paid in actual currency, not scrip, and the company store lost its monopoly. The foreman posted plain rules for powder timbering and lanterns, and he kept a ledger the men could witness. The upstream springs were reopened by federal order, declared public commons. Clean water channels were constructed. Children stopped vomiting. Elders stopped coughing blood. Life began to return. Dan Whitfield recovered from his beating, though scars remained. The territorial governor granted him a full pardon and canceled his debts. He remained the telegraph operator. When a widow from the next town stopped to send a message, Dan found himself talking to her, and by spring 1880, they were married. Jules spent 3 weeks recovering. His ribs healed, though they ached in cold weather. The federal government compensated him with enough money to properly equip his clinic. He kept the jars of contaminated sediment on a shelf where everyone could see a reminder that truth mattered. He died in 1903 at 65, and the entire town shut down for his funeral. Bob collected his reward and a letter of commendation. The experience changed him. He left Crystal Creek in spring 1879 and was last heard of working as a deputy marshal in Wyoming. Samuel kept his position under new management. When the new manager asked him to falsify numbers, Samuel refused and reported it. The manager was removed. Samuel was promoted. He married a schoolteacher in 1879 and raised 4 children. One morning in late October, Louisa stood outside the mine office, now under federal management, watching workers replace the white paint with gray. Sarah Chen, whom Louisa was training as a clerk, approached with a newspaper. The verdict came through. Mr. Voss received 20 years. Louisa took the paper, scanning it. At the bottom was a note: Thomas Earl pleaded guilty, 15 years. R. Morris remains at large. 20 years. Sarah said quietly, "My uncle died for what was in those books. Does that seem enough?" Louisa thought about Chen's cold fingers pressing the brass key into her palm. "Justice is rarely enough," she said finally, "but it is better than silence." As they walked to the office, Louisa noticed other changes. The company store had closed, replaced by 3 independent merchants. Wages were posted publicly. Men still worked dangerous jobs, but not until their hands shook from mercury. Inside, Henderson was bent over maps. "Miss Greaves, I need your knowledge of the old records. Dumping sites before Voss. We need to clean the river properly." Louisa leaned over the map, cataloging coded entries from the black ledger. "There," she said, pointing. "And there. This section near the confluence, they dumped there at night for 2 years." Henderson marked each location grimly. "This will take years to remedy. But now we know where to begin." As Louisa left, she passed the old assay room. The room stood empty now, stripped the shelves bare. Someone had painted over the green door. It looked ordinary, as though nothing momentous had happened there. But Louisa remembered. She would always remember. Winter came early. By December, snow lay thick on the mountains, and the creek ran cold beneath ice along its edges. Louisa taught in the new schoolhouse now. One afternoon, Dan stopped by with his new wife, Martha. "Thought you might want to see this," Dan said, handing her a telegram. "Just came through." Louisa read it quickly. Gustav Voss, deceased. Pneumonia. December 30, 1880. She handed it back, something in her chest loosening. Closure. The prison doctor didn't look too close. Dan added quietly, "Word is, the other prisoners have their own justice for men who poison children." Martha touched her husband's arm gently. "How are you both?" Louisa asked. Dan's scarred face softened. "Good. Real good. Getting married next month. Properly. We would like you and Tokala to stand witness." "We would be honored," Louisa said. After they left, Louisa sat in the empty schoolroom, listening to wind rattle windows. She thought about justice and vengeance, not the same thing, but sometimes arriving at the same destination. Voss was dead. Earl was in prison. Morris had vanished. And Crystal Creek continued, not perfect, but alive and slowly healing. Spring came reluctantly in 1881, melting snow in fits and starts. The river ran high, with snowmelt carrying away accumulated poison. Tokala returned in late April, riding into town on a warm afternoon when cottonwoods were beginning to leaf. Louisa was teaching a class on clean water and the fevers that followed a poisoned creek when she saw him through the window. She finished the lesson without rushing, but her heart had already left. When the children scattered, she walked outside to find him waiting by the creek, watching water flow clear over stones scoured clean by winter. "The river is healing," he said without preamble. "The springs run clean. My people no longer bury children who drank poisoned water." "I am glad," Louisa said, meaning it completely. They stood in silence, listening to the water's music, so different from the toxic sludge that had surged through the gulch. "There is a missionary in the encampment." Tokala said, his voice carrying its usual flat quality, but his eyes held warmth. "He performs marriages according to both traditions. If you were willing." Louisa looked at him, at this man, who never smiled, but who had stayed beside her when staying meant death, who had pulled her from a tilting bridge and carried a wounded doctor and never suggested she was less than his equal. "Yes," she said simply. "I would be willing." His mouth did not quite smile, but the corners lifted just enough to show he had heard not just her words, but everything beneath them. They were married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony blending traditions neither had been born into, but both had chosen. Jules stood as witness hands, shaking, but face serene. Dan and Martha attended, and Sarah, Chen, and Bob sent a telegram that made Louisa laugh genuinely. They built a small cabin on the eastern edge of town, close to the school and open country. It was not luxurious, but it was theirs, every board chosen and placed by their own hands, every decision made together. The years that followed were not easy, but they were lived on terms Louisa and Tokala chose. The river continued its patient work of restoration. Fish returned. Birds nested in cottonwoods. Willows grew thick along banks' roots, holding soil that had been scoured bare. Crystal Creek grew slowly into something resembling an actual community. More families came. A proper church was built then, a hospital where Jules worked until his hands failed in 1903. The school needed a second teacher, then a third. Through it all, Louisa and Tokala built a life that was not perfect, but profoundly real. Tokala never smiled often. His face remained mostly stone. But sometimes when Louisa was teaching children by the riverbank, or tending the garden, or simply sitting beside him watching light fade from the hills, he would look at her, and something would soften in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she understood everything it meant. And Louisa, who had once laughed at rain because the alternative was screaming, found she no longer needed that reflex. The fear had not disappeared. She suspected it never would. But it no longer controlled her. It was just another thing she had survived. One morning in spring 1887, 9 years after the storm that changed everything, Louisa walked down to the river, as she often did. The dawn air carried the scent of wet earth and growing things, and the water ran clear over stones that sparkled in early light. She stood on the bank, breathing deeply, thinking about the people who had brought her to this moment. Chen, who died pressing evidence into her palm. Jules, who chose truth over safety. Dan, who finished sending a telegraph, even as his face was smashed into a desk. Bob, who chose the right side, almost by accident. And Tokala, who never promised safety or comfort, but gave her something more valuable, certainty that she could trust him with her life, her truth, her complicated self. She heard him approach, felt his presence before she turned. They stood together, watching the river flow, and in the comfortable silence was understanding that required no words. The water sang over stones, carrying away the last traces of poison. A fish jumped silver flash in morning light. Somewhere upstream, a bird called to its mate. "For the next fight," Tokala said quietly, repeating their private covenant. "For the next fight." Louisa agreed, and she smiled, not the desperate laugh fear had once forced from her, but genuine contentment earned through fire and flood, and the slow, patient work of healing. The river flowed on, indifferent to human drama, following the ancient path gravity had carved through stone. But to Louisa, standing with the man who had become her anchor and adventure, both it seemed like something more like proof that poisoned things could be cleansed, that broken things could be made whole, that the work of healing was never finished, but always worth attempting. Tokala's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with easy familiarity of years spent building trust, gesture by gesture. His palm was calloused, warm, real. Neither spoke because everything worth saying had been said in 1,000 small choices, in moments of shared danger and shared silence. The sun climbed higher, painting the water gold. The day stretched ahead full of ordinary tasks and small pleasures. And in that ordinariness was grace, the grace of survival, of healing, of choosing each other over and over, in a world that had given them every reason to choose otherwise. They stood there until the sun was well up, then turned together and walked back toward the cabin, toward the life they had built from wreckage and determination. Behind them, the river continued its eternal work, and ahead lay whatever the future held. But in that moment, standing between past and future, they were exactly where they needed to be. Together. Whole. Home.